Let's go. Welcome to another edition of More is Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. My name is Jamal Binden, and More is moving in Omaha for race equity. Our goal is to deal with anti-racism, race equity issues. Our agenda is an anti-racist organization. We're fighting for racial equality in communities through engagement, education, and advocacy. We've been around for about 10 years, and we changed our name about a year ago. And so we're kind of involved in trying to bring a lot of light to all the racism and race inequities, or deal with inequities in our community and in our state. So you'll hear more from us as we go forward in as many of these endeavors in the community. So with me today, I have Paul Feilmann, who is a retired mental health activist, and has worked with one of the many companies dealing with package delivery for a while. He's also got to know him from his vigil of protesting about the Nebraska Department of Corrections and things related to trying to improve the conditions for not only the inmates, but also the workers. He's attended many community forums dealing with anti-racism, community engagement issues, and race equity in terms of trying to push the envelope to help institutions and organizations do a better job. He also raised the reparation issue about a year or so ago, and got some good coverage on that. And I know he's very much involved in how you have those conversations and shaping and so on to help our community. And also he's involved in how do you evaluate some of those issues in our apartheid community. One of the terms that I coined that I heard from Paul initially was the term reverse engineering. He could talk more about that down the road too, but it's one of those terms that you say you can tell a lot just by looking at the end and going forward in a different direction. I invited him again on the show to update us on some things he's working on, racial, social justice issues, and issues just dealing with racial healing. So Paul Feilmann, welcome to More Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. First, I want to start off, first tell a little bit more about yourself and maybe get a little bit of overview of some things that you've been working on and go from there. Paul?
Yeah, I have a master's degree in social work, and I'm a licensed mental health therapist. I've worked with children and families in many environments, schools, corrections facilities, inpatient, outpatient mental health centers, really just working with folks and helping them achieve maximum potential as far as their overall mental health and their functioning, within their family and job and overall living situations. Retired from that several years ago, and just have gotten back involved in social work type efforts in the community since then.
So Paul, let's get the elephant on the table first, as we say, deconstruct or off the table, however you want to put that. Recently you appeared on the radio talk show program, and you told a story where you actually used the N-word, where you actually said it out on the radio. And you caught some flack for that, about the term from a community members. Can you outline with our viewing audience what happened and what did you do to clean up that situation?
Yeah, and I had, William King has a radio show in North Omaha. It's Facebook Live as well as on the radio. And he and I have collaborated together in terms of sharing information and trying to disseminate information to the community in terms of some of the activism efforts that I've made. And he's involved in a lot of activities as well. I know I went up and saw him. He worked on getting Wi-Fi set up at Macy in the Indian reservation up there, Native American reservation up there. And I went up and saw him do that work, and they had a ribbon cutting ceremony. He's done a lot of things in the community and looking to improve the community. And so I went on his show to talk about a couple things. I was updating him on the overcrowding in the state prisons, which I've kind of monitored and communicated with several people, senators and so forth, over the last couple of years. And I was giving him an update on that crisis. And then we also talked about my planned trip down to Oklahoma City. I was going down there to participate in some activities around an individual named Julius Jones. There was going to be a commutation hearing in the Pardons Board down there, trying to see if they could take him off of death row. There was questions about whether he was innocent or not, and whether there was structural racism that was involved in his trial. And one of the things that I talked about in that was the quotes about some racist terminology that was used by one of the jurors at the time of the trial. and one juror had told another juror that Julius Jones should be just taken out back and killed because he's the N-word. And I actually said the N-word to, I don't know exactly why I said it, but afterwards I realized that it was a pretty destructive thing to do on my part. And it really impacted a lot of people that I've worked with in terms of the effect that had. It's a very degrading term, and to folks that I've worked with in the community, and since then I've made an effort to apologize to some people that I've been working with closely, and in my understanding of dealing with these kinds of things, there's a few things you have to do. One is acknowledge that you had a hurtful behavior, and in my saying that word publicly, I've realized, and I knew at the time, I just didn't stop myself from saying it and acknowledging that I did it, and it was very hurtful. Second is to work on, apologizing to the people that I could reach out to and let them know, and this is another avenue I'm trying to do that. And then also making efforts to ensure that I don't ever do that sort of thing again, which is requiring me to educate myself on cultural issues and sensitize myself to things that can be very hurtful in terms of dealing with different cultures and different races in my community. So that's what I'm trying to do. I reached out to William King and a couple other people that I've been working closely with, and realized that I had caused some real distress and really damaged some relationships there. And I talked to you as well. So that's kind of the story on that right now.
I'm glad you shared that, because it reminded me of a situation years ago where I was involved in a table talk type event, or it was an event that UNO held, and there was a professor who was involved in theater, and we were in the community with about 5 or 6 people talking about after this event. It was like on a weekend, I think, or not sure. But anyway, this particular individual used the N-word on at least once or 2 occasions. I basically asked this person to stop doing that. And his response was, I'm going to desensitize you to the word by using it, which is very arrogant. And so if you use it again, you just won't find me participating. Anyway, to make a long story short, he continued to feel that it was his arrogance to tell me how he's going to use the N-word from his perspective. And I didn't participate anymore, but I told the story to many people that, there are certain things, certain people don't like: profanity, vulgar words, obviously terms that have been used historically to degrade people of color. And we need to be sensitive to that, but it's not the role of a racist or particularly an elitist, Confederate loving personality to tell me when and when not to use the N-word. But again, it can be a teachable moment, but we just need to be conscious of how do we move beyond some of the insensitivity that people project when they think they're trying to help you. In actual fact, they're traumatizing you, particularly when our society does that all the time. I want to switch up a bit, and I've been watching white liberals and so-called allies work in our community on race issues. Sometimes people may call you a great white savior, some of the things that you're involved in. How do you avoid that pejorative term, and what kind of warm handoff can you provide or point to that shows your effectiveness when you do this kind of work in communities dealing with race, poverty, and advocacy in general? So kind of give us a little bit more feedback. How do you address some of those agendas when you do this, oftentimes as an individual?
Well, I hadn't really thought about the whole white savior thing as I got started in meeting people in the community that were experiencing different kinds of issues, ranging from poverty to racism and structural racism. But I've learned a bit more about it. I really have taken a look at ways to try and decentralize myself in my efforts, mostly focusing on building relationships and collaborative relationships, as well as respecting the self-determination of different groups that I'm working with and empowering them to have more control over opportunities and resources, and controlling their destiny, and making sure that I can do anything I can behind the scenes to support that, as opposed to making myself the primary driver of my efforts in terms of publicity, or putting myself out there in front of everybody.
Mm-hmm. Now, Many have been following this whole issue with the university, their white fragility in dealing with the attempt to address racism. And I know that they've been pushed back by the governor. The governor said some very mean-spirited things, almost to the point he's talking about cancel culture, where you can't even talk about history. And one of the scenarios I throw out back to those individuals is, can you imagine people who live in Germany not talking about the Holocaust or what the Nazi Germans did to the Jewish people, and say that's off limits, we can't talk about it because we as Germans may feel bad? I mean, it sounds of the same vernacular, the same mentality. But my question basically is coming back to, as we're dealing with this university and the NAASP and so on, how do you address that, or what are you reading to that whole situation? Because again, it goes front and center to what you've been talking about related to trying to improve race relations in the state of Nebraska. What is your play on that whole scenario?
You know, I have a hard time trying to process all of it. I think it comes down to the issues of racism and anti-racism, trying to look at people as individuals and looking at policies that group people together in negative ways and treat them in negative ways is what we call racist. And the elimination of opportunities that comes with those kind of racist behaviors. That's what, and the history of that too. Like you said, Germany has got a history of racism against the Jewish race. And the United States has very clear issues around race regarding, particular groups of individuals. The university is trying to address those kinds of issues and increase opportunities, equal opportunities for people of all racial backgrounds to have access to the education and to the resources there. Plus, that strengthens the relationship of all the students to have students from all different races. I've got a picture here I wanted to show you, Jamal. This is, I think I mentioned to you that Omaha per capita is the highest number of immigrants in the country. And this is an amazing picture. I just came across it. It's a Norman Rockwell picture. This is Omaha. That's what Omaha looks like. And the differences are our strength. And that's what the university is trying to acknowledge, is that the diversity of our population is our strength.
Paul, we just lost you there. Okay, are you back in? Good.
Yeah.
We went blank for a minute. Are you
Yeah,
there?
the diversity, yeah, can you hear me now?
Yeah, it went blank for a while. Good, I can hear you now.
Had somebody calling in. The diversity of our population is our strength. All the cultural values and strengths and different points of view is our strength. And there's also, the history of racism in this country is something that it's like what I said before. You have to acknowledge when you made mistakes. You have to acknowledge the harm that was caused, and then you have to work to repair those harms. And that's what the United States is trying to do when it comes to the history of racism towards Blacks and Native Americans in particular.
As you mentioned that, I was just thinking about, there was a recent news article about the city of Omaha I guess they're voting, or they might have already happened by the time this air, to pay $42,000 to an African-American woman, and I guess her son, where they did some racial profiling by the Omaha Police Department. And it was kind of surprising how quick that happened. I suspect that happens a lot more looking at the people we got on the force and so on. But it would be interesting to have some kind of a dialogue with the community on how do you clean that stuff up? Because again, with Mr. Berryhill's passing a couple of years ago or so, and you got some other things, there's really not been assurance to the community that they have dealt with some of those internal issues that cause lawsuits like that for us to end up settling so quickly. So it's one of those issues we need to deal with. I want to move on if I can. Many of us are serious about anti-poverty programs and fighting poverty. I know you've been involved in that with some of the things you've been involved in and organized. And I know you had a vigil downtown for a number of weeks, if not months. And there's a community agency called NCAP, Eastern Nebraska agency that deals with so-called poverty in this community. Do you know anything about what they do, any of those members? And some years ago, they sent me a survey where they wanted to address poverty. I found it strange that an agency that deals with poverty would ask me about poverty, particularly that's their mission, what they do. But my question is, what do you know about this organization? Have they worked with you in light of all the attention and that you've directed towards addressing poverty in Omaha in particular?
No, I had some communication with them. It's pretty limited though. Um, and that's kind of the challenge of the work that I've been doing, is trying to meet as many people as I can that I think may be working on some of the same issues. I don't have a professional standing. I don't have an organization, so I have to just develop those relationships pretty much independently. And I've kind of learned to um, assume that people are doing some good things and try and find out what those things are and how I can collaborate with those to build on those good things. And if there's some negative things going on in terms of racism, those are issues that I'll try and identify and figure out how I can collaborate with organizations to address those as well. And NCAP's just another example of that. I built some relationships more so with some other organizations than with NCAP. I think Voices for Children has been particularly helpful for me because they're the ones that gave me the data on the extent of the poverty in the community. And I think Rachel on your board is also looking at that kind of data. That's extremely helpful. I don't think people fully understand the extent of that poverty and the impact in the community and those folks. But in terms of that vigil I did, that's how I got to meet those people, is reaching out to people. And I met so many people by being down at City Hall for 10 weeks. I'm thinking I should go back down there and just have the lunchroom there and set up shop and have, just to be visible again, because people know me down there. And it really gives me a chance to talk to city council members. There's just a wide range of people that know me and I can continue to collaborate with. That's really I can't amplify my work without that collaboration. That's why I appreciate being able to do this tonight.
The other thing is you mentioned that, I think the other thing we could use reverse engineer in terms of that concept, where Omaha was reported some years ago, it had one of the highest per capita poverty rate in light of all the millionaires and billionaires we got running around here. And so it's unfortunate that people saw it as a shock, but yet there was a number of subterfuges and kind of band-aids thrown at the issue, and the numbers have not changed that much. And it's like the conversation of racial healing and reparation. In other words, unless there's a massive income transfer or laws that protect the most vulnerable in our society, and particularly with this pandemic, it makes it even worse for people of color, and particularly low-income people in our state. So that's one of the things we'd hope that these so-called industrial complex nonprofits would do, is a better job of communicating to our communities, but also bringing people to the table who can help address that. You spent some time standing outside the prison in Lincoln, and my question is, why did you do that, and what did you get out of that per se?
Well, I kind of learned when I first started going into the community and meeting people and learning about, the health of the community. I learned that there was a high number of individuals in the community that were impacted by incarceration, children, families. I think the numbers are upwards of 80 to 100,000 people in Nebraska have a family member that's incarcerated, children, brothers, sisters, friends. And the impact of incarceration seemed to be extremely toxic. So I learned more about that. And I started working on legislation to change some of the things that were going on inside of the state prisons, including solitary confinement. But I also started volunteering and going in and supporting a group called the 7-Step Group of residents at the prison that were working to better themselves and better other residents in terms of building their ability to leave prison and not come back. And I got to know those guys, and they really get a lot of validation when people come to the prison and spend time with them and take the time to listen to what they have to say and how they're dealing with things. I did that through CS Rise. It's another organization that goes into all the prisons. I've done that. been to all the prisons, as well as Nebraska State Penitentiary. But once the virus hit, I couldn't do that anymore. What the guys got from participation from the outside was validation. It's validation is just them feeling valued, which then gave them motivation, and then they continue to work on their rehabilitation. And they've continually expressed that appreciation for the people. When I was at the governor's mansion, you saw me down there. That was covered on all the news channels, and to this day, guys still remember when I was doing that. It made it real. It acknowledged that they were inside of those prison walls. Otherwise, the community just forgets about them as human beings. And and the virus prevented us from doing anything inside. So some of the people I volunteered with, set up signs on the outside so the public would see that the guys on the inside were not forgotten. And one of the big signs that we had was, "You never go to prison alone," which really brings home the message of how many people are impacted by one life going inside a prison.
By the way, when you were outside the governor's mansion, did you ever talk to you? Did you ever meet the governor at any point? Does he really?
No, I reached out to leaders in the community, and Preston Love reached out to the governor at my request and was able to leverage his relationship, and Jasmine Harris, to meet and discuss the prison crisis at the time. And then the governor and the director of prisons decided that it would be reasonable for the director to start coming up to Omaha and talking to people in the community that were impacted by incarceration. And that started, unfortunately, it didn't continue at that time because of the virus. But since then, Preston Love had developed a pretty good relationship with the director of corrections, who does understand race issues to a certain extent, and the impact of incarceration. And he recently came up and spoke, and I think that he's going to continue to do that in the community.
Well, Paul, one of the things I always question him on, he's never really been up in the community until recently. He's been on the job for a number of years. He's probably one of the highest paid wardens in this area. But can you point to specific things he's done since he's been communicating with you guys? Is there anything that he's done significant, as in something we could brag about or talk about?
Well, I know that since I've been volunteering down there and since I've met him, he is a very strong advocate of people from the outside coming into the prisons. I spent a whole day at Tecumseh State Penitentiary with a group of guys that had been in voluntary solitary confinement for their own protection. And the process of getting to know the guys during that entire day was real productive for those guys. And one of the volunteers that was there that day was the director of prisons, Scott Frakes. He spent the whole day doing everything that the other volunteers were doing. I don't think the other volunteers knew that he was the director of prisons. I knew he was. I watched him all day.
I mean, but here's my question. Has there been any policy change or procedure change that have addressed some of the craziness that have happened in prisons in the recent years that you're aware of that he's done as a result of communicating with you, press, and whoever else he's met with in the community? Is there anything substantive is what I'm really saying?
Yeah, I think there's been changes in numerous policies around the solitary confinement. I know they've gotten rid of one of the most notorious solitary confinement units. The guy that did the ACLU investigation is an international known special researcher on the impact of solitary confinement. He told me that the unit called the South 40 at NSP, the state penitentiary, was one of the worst he'd ever seen in his entire career. And Director Frakes got rid of that. He's made efforts to do things with very limited resources and huge staffing problems. It's not perfect. His efforts haven't been perfect, but I do believe that he's made a lot of consistent programmatic efforts. And I've talked to people that have worked with him from the outside that have done advocacy for guys in the inside, and have said that they feel that Director Frakes really does have a conscience about making positive impact. Now that he's got resources to pay good staff to come in, he can invest in things like college education, rehabilitation. I just read some information about South Carolina reduced their recidivism rate to 21%. And I sent that information to Director Frakes. That's the kind of thing that he can do now that he's got actual resources. We haven't invested. It's like teachers in our schools. If we don't invest in our schools and our teachers, we're not going to get anything.
And Paul, I'm not saying you can't do that. I'm just saying that when I look at the end results, I don't see substantive changes. At least if they're doing it, it's not always on the internet or reported out. So again, I know great intentions are good, but again, I'm going to look at the data. And one of the issues we also got to talk about down the road is, you know, people sometimes talk about the criminal legal system. They don't call it criminal justice because that's an oxymoron in a sense. But the way we treat people in this country, we have one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, even more so than Russia and China. But again, when somebody gives somebody 20 years or 30 years, when they should give them 5 years, and then we can show that racially is disproportionate impacting upon African Americans and brown and Native American folks, Asians is a lot smaller. But again, those are the kind of things we need to talk about to say, how do you make sure the judges and the lawyers, the county attorneys are not playing the race card against groups? And it's obvious it's happened historically just by looking at the Innocent Project. That's a classic example of the negativity in our society. I'm going to switch up if I can. I attend the 360 meetings where I was forced to by my employee for about I would say about a year and a half. And it was a painful meeting for me to sit in there. They're some of the nicest people in the world, but nothing came out of it. And I know that you've been attending them. What are their goals and outcomes that you notice from your being a frequent visitor to those meetings? I couldn't determine much from them just sitting in the room. I mean, they were nice people, but at the end of the day, I didn't see any structural policy changes or changes in the institutions that were in that room. So maybe you have a better insight than I do, and I might have been sleeping sitting in the meeting. I'm not confessing there, but what do you see coming out of 360 meetings?
Well, one of the things that's particularly helpful for me is to get a clear picture of the impact in the community of violence and how it's being addressed in the community, how the police see that. And then it also gives me a chance to look at ways that, like you said, backward engineer things and look at what are the sources of these kinds of things. It's kind of what led me to understand the impact of poverty. One of the national organizations that the police department are a part of look at one of their big priorities right now is early childhood education and major investments in early childhood, because they understand, and the chief of police understands, that poverty is a major driver for criminal activity and so forth. Now there's a lot of other complicating issues with that, but I always look for ways that I can collaborate with everybody, because I think there usually are some interesting ways that I can collaborate. I'm collaborating with some people that I would never expect to collaborate with on things like creating opportunities for everybody, no matter what their racial background is or what their financial situation is, and getting opportunities for kids to move out of poverty and have opportunities. The police department has a lot of connections and a lot of things that they're doing that I can work with those folks to try and make some positive changes. And if there's things that I see that I can make changes in to eliminate negative things, I will try and do that. You know, one of the things I've just recently sent a video to all the law enforcement departments in the city regarding a major investigation done in Utah about the use of deadly force. It's called Shots Fired. It's a frontline PBS investigation that takes a look at all the complicating factors regarding the use of deadly force by police departments. And it talks about training, and it talks about ethical issues and racial issues, community issues. I sent that out to all of the police departments, and I hope to follow up and see if they can have a public meeting, community meeting, and show that movie and actually talk about how Omaha can make sure that we never have another police involved shooting again if we can possibly help it.
By the way, when did you do that? How long ago was that?
About 3 weeks ago.
Okay, so we'll give them a little time, but you know, I know that people sent stuff to them before, but I think there must be something going on there to deal with that. Oftentimes use the term, by the way, switching up the term magic wand, or in other words, if you had a magic wand, what would you change to help improve our community? And so one of the things that Again, I wonder, going back to the concept we talked about, what do you see the three things that we should be addressing to help oppressed folks? And again, using that metaphor of a magic wand, what do you think from your vantage point we should be dealing with?
Oh,
Is that a deep question or what?
yeah, I think that part of it is really it comes down to understanding the the issue of how extensive childhood poverty is in Omaha, how it impacts uh, the number of people in the community of color.
So in other words, if you address poverty in childhood, that would be one of the major things you would address. What's another issue you would address?
The I would love to get racial reparations out on the table and actually make some serious redistribution of wealth and so forth. And I think that linking different groups in the community around that issue, I think there could be some real significant efforts made, and some public acknowledgement and major redistribution of wealth in this community if it's handled systematically and drawn to the attention of different groups, both Black and white.
What's your third one?
Probably law enforcement, trying to continue to build positive community collaboration with law enforcement and addressing mental health issues so that law enforcement's role can be much more narrowly defined to where they are only involved in situations that they absolutely have to be involved in for safety.
Oh, good. Appreciate you getting to the point of that, because I think different people have different answers. I've heard different folks when I threw that out at them. As we talked earlier, you've adopted, and also we use the term today, you said backwards engineering versus reverse engineering. And that means going to the source. But first, define both. Why is that important in social justice work, that concept or that term that you use?
It just helps me learn and figure out questions to ask when I'm talking with people, trying to go back. The biggest thing, I was kind of going back over some of my social work background today, and I was looking at what I'm doing and why I'm trying to do it. And this is one of the things that's right at the beginning, the first paragraph of the Code of Ethics for Nebraska or National Association of Social Workers. It says a primary mission of the social work profession is to enhance human well-being and meet basic human needs of all people, with particular attention to the needs and empowerment of people who are vulnerable, oppressed, and living in poverty. And to go back and fully understand where those things are being impacted by the most, where the most people are being denied those opportunities, you have to kind of go back upstream and look at where the pollution is and where the toxicity is coming from. It's just like toxins in your water supply. You got to go back upstream. You got poison in your water. You have to go back upstream and look at where it's at. And that's where I look at backward engineering as the main. And then the bang for your buck, you're going to have the most impact on the most people by disrupting things at the source, rather than going downstream and just addressing things at the end of incarceration or, suicide prevention.
Mm-hmm. In the circles that I move in, I'm aware people are so-called appointed or anointed or influential leaders, and has other words to describe some of these people. Meanwhile, the masses of oppressed folks are left in the cold and trying to deal with the issues as best as they can. In other words, fend for themselves. How can we avoid being the I writer as contrasted to the we? And the reason I say that is oftentimes I'm reminded of Mrs. Charlotte Shropshire, who was late, a great friend of my mom, and she used to say, when you listen to somebody use the word I too many times, kind of walk away from it, because they're not talking the collective, the we. We also hear people talk about we're part of a village, our society, our community, and so on. And so there's a different thing when you come at it from an I versus a we or a us. Talk to me a little bit about how do you avoid hanging out or dealing with or becoming an I writer?
One of the lessons I learned is empowerment as a critical element of social change and bettering our community. That I learned that lesson years ago. That used to be a condition back in the 60s where children that were born with a disability like Down syndrome would automatically be shunted off to a state institution. The family would be told, this is going to be the best for your child, and there was a very dehumanizing process that went on. The way that got changed is a large group of parents who were directly impacted by the trauma of having their children separated from them. They band together and developed political power and legal power, sued the state of Nebraska, won, and now you have laws that provide for all kinds of education and resources for children and adults with disabilities. And that's how I see social change occurring, is empowering people that are oppressed, giving them ways, channels, collaborating on ways that they can develop political strength and financial strength and whatever it takes to achieve equal opportunities. Equal opportunity is the whole equity issue that we're talking about, and getting people out of poverty. When they have, if everybody in the community has equal opportunity, you will not see poverty be a problem anymore.
Right, right. Many of the challenges we face can be traced back to poor education, miseducation. What can you suggest that improve the quality of education for students who don't know much about social justice?
Well, what I did is I just started asking people that had done the work done work around those issues. And I listen to them. I follow them on social media. I learn. I've got over 130 books that I track on Audible.
What do you mean when you use the word you track on Audible? What does that mean?
Well, I don't have time to go read all of them, but like, for instance, I just pulled down it's a short autobiography by Frederick Douglass. And listening to him, I was driving this week. I drive a lot back and forth to Des Moines to see my dad, who's 96. And I listened to things, and I was listening to his powerful description, first person, of slavery and what that was like for him. And so I'll take things like that and different perspectives, and I'll learn about those people in history, and I'll try and do more research and talk to people and ask them, people like you or whoever else I can find to talk to. I'll talk to them, and then I learn more, and I'll get more resources, and I do more investigation, and I share those things.
Okay.
When I talk to people, if I'm trying to collaborate, I mean, one of your board members met with me, and I gave her some information and told her about meetings, and then people start showing up at the meetings, and they're always thankful about those links and information. So people that want to make change and see these issues will work in collaboration together.
By the way, you alluded to your degree in social work and working in the area. Did you get much cultural or racial understanding when you were getting your master's degree in social work and becoming a therapist? Was there race and poverty addressed? I assume you went locally in Nebraska.
No, and that was a real deficit. And that's probably something that I'm going to be working on, is talking to the Department of Social Work. I took one class, it's probably through Black Studies. It had to do with children and race. And that's the only class I ever had. So yeah.
In other words, you didn't go to school here in Nebraska for your master's degree?
I did, at UNO.
Oh, but you say there was no courses offered in social work dealing with race and ethnicity?
No.
Wow.
Just the one that I took, which is, yeah, that's a huge.
No, you took it in another department, though. You took it in Black Studies, right?
It
wasn't in social work the way you described it just now.
I don't know if it was I don't think it was in the social work department. No, I think it was in another department.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, and that's one of my concerns, is that you got these folks graduating from the university with master's degree in social work, and they've never been in North and South Omaha. You got teachers the same way, where they're going to be educating, or so-called educating, students of color, and particularly low-income students, and they've never had any formal education dealing with poverty, the ramifications of it, the issues of income disparities, disproportionalities. The same thing in law schools. You got all these folks who are learning on the job, and oftentimes they're not learning the right stuff because they're being taught by the wrong people. And so one of the concerns is, how do we broaden that circle? One of the criticism I've had of the social work department is they should all have a mandatory course on the Indian Child Welfare Act. And again, we treat Native Americans differently according to the act. And you can't just go and hijack the kids and do what they do and snatch them out. So education is very important, because again, if you don't have the right education, coming in with that arrogant mentality, and you don't know how to deal with some of the issues that we have not solved in this state or in this community. But hopefully some of this can change if folks start to listen and watch programs like this, and do a decent survey about the people who get out of there. One of the things you keep coming back to, and I know it's a recurring theme with you, Paul, and I know you have a certain amount of vested interest with the police department. How do you rate the local Omaha police community relations? Despite some recent shakeups, they've had some changes at the top. And I also, one of them actually moved over to a better job with the airport security. But what is your perspective of the police department from maybe a macro, a bigger level versus the micro? And again, like you say, you talk about the police department constantly in some of the work that you do. But what do you think of our local Omaha Police Department, and maybe even the Sheriff Department?
I found that I've been able to find some areas that I think are very important to make changes in, and I found a willingness to address those. One being mental health. I know that the police have also, there's this kind of, you talked about 360, there's this kind of odd thing with research about youth and crime, and one of the high impact times is after school. And one of the things that the police department has done is a very extensive, I mean, it's really an enormous youth sports program that is all focused on youth of color, literally 100%. You can go to it if you're white, but it's really centered primarily for kids of color, and it's extensively run by law enforcement officers and volunteers. That's just an example of something constructive. They've also got, I think they're pushing 15 therapists now that are working on mental health. I'm looking at helping them transition into a separate mental health referral program where they divert non-crisis or crisis things that are, don't require law enforcement into a non-law enforcement response. And they've been really open to doing those kinds of things. I know the people that are doing it. I've been involved with them. One of them's a friend of mine. He's one of their therapists that goes out on calls, and he's told me he's taught police officers a ton of stuff that they never would have learned without him going out there. And so and like, I had that meeting about poverty downtown, and the chief of police was sitting right there. He took the time to come and listen. And I know that he's worked with some other people on addressing poverty and being aware of some of these issues. I have some real other issues with him, use of deadly force. And I think racism in the department has been a huge issue. And I think that's something that they're really struggling to overcome. And I still think that addressing use of deadly force, and what's that called, implicit bias, in terms of like you said, that case where the woman felt that she was profiled. There's a lot of folks that still in the community have a lot of very strong feelings about being profiled and how they're dealt with in the. I just saw an interesting thing on the news tonight. It was a city where they have a Black police chief, but they have taken, I think, 2 or 3 homes, and they've converted them to police community homes. And a police officer stays and works out of that as kind of an office space for 3 years. And it's used as a community engagement space where kids can come and hang out, and the police can engage and mentor kids in the neighborhood. I thought it was a very interesting idea. And those are the kind of ideas I'll take to the police chief and suggest, and I usually get some reasonable response. So anyway, I do see some areas where they're willing to collaborate, and but they still have, other major issues to address.
We're coming down to our last minutes of the show, and I wanted to give you an opportunity. Oftentimes when we do these shows, there's so many different issues we cover. We jump around, we switch up. But Paul, do you have any closing comments for our viewing audience in terms of our conversation today? Things you'd like to leave us with? Sometimes we call them pearls of wisdom, heavy light, whatever. But what would you like to share with our viewing audience?
Well, I guess probably the thing that's been the most eye-opening to me is that this is Omaha, and we don't acknowledge that this is Omaha, and we have to get out of our comfort zone and get to know, all the different groups in Omaha and make sure that everybody's having the same opportunities, and that we don't segregate everybody that's not white into one area of the community with a denial of opportunities. And I just think that the community has a moral obligation to do that.
Well, appreciate that. And one of the things, Paul, I really appreciate you coming on the air, talking about some of the work that you do and being open to being challenged and dealing with some what we call thought-provoking questions. And so, again, hopefully we'll get a chance to do more of this. But one of our goals we like to deal with more, moving Omaha with race equity, is to have some of those issues that our local media will not cover. They're afraid, or else they just are so busy dealing with Facebook or soundbites. So this becomes that community conversation to help people deal with folks who are in the know and know how to work. So really appreciate you, Paul, being here today, and hopefully we can have you back again to share some of the other endeavors that you're working on.
Okay.
We hope that you've enjoyed this edition of More Throwing Out Some Heavy Light. Join us again for another edition. We'll see you later. Baroko.